Welcome to this deep dive. We're tackling a topic that feels like it's been whispered about for centuries, really.
Mm,
And now science is starting to actually lean in and listen.
yeah.
This is about the fascinating, sometimes, well, unsettling link between psychedelic experiences and the profound question of divine existence.
It really is an age-old quest, isn't it? Humans exploring altered states to try and understand reality. And for this deep dive, we've really dug into your stack of sources, articles, some cutting-edge research papers, and foundational philosophical texts that grapple with this exact mystery.
Right. So our mission here is to unpack these materials for you to see what the claims and, the findings actually suggest about consciousness, about reality, and maybe what people throughout history have called God.
We'll be looking at ancient traditions, modern neuroscience.
We'll even touch on theories from quantum physics, bring in some philosophy.
Exactly. What happens when we put all these diverse pieces together? What can they actually tell us about experiences described by so many as, well, encountering the divine?
So if we start at the beginning, it seems pretty clear humans have this deep history of intentionally altering consciousness.
Absolutely. To explore deeper truths.
And your sources really highlight that psychedelics have been incredibly powerful tools in this quest for millennia. We're talking substances like psilocybin, DMT, LSD.
Yeah, not just recreational things, but tools used in very sacred contexts. Historically, spiritually, their significance is profound, especially in indigenous cultures where these practices have, survived.
Like the Mazatec people?
Right. Consider the Mazatec in Mexico. They use psilocybin mushrooms they call tunatical, and that name itself literally translates to flesh of the gods.
Wow.
Or you look at Amazonian traditions using the ayahuasca brew, which is rich in DMT.
Okay, and what's the common thread? What are the reports from these traditions saying?
Well, what's striking is this recurring theme. Reports of contact with what they perceive as divine beings or ancestral spirits, or sometimes just feeling directly connected to the very fabric of existence itself.
These aren't just vague feelings then.
No, not usually. They're often described as, like, hyper-real encounters. And the universality of these accounts, across different cultures, different times, it forces the question, are these just culturally shaped hallucinations?
Or could they be windows into something, well, deeper, something real, maybe even divine?
Exactly. And that's really the starting point for our exploration today.
Okay, so if ancient wisdom points towards these kinds of experiences, what happens when modern science, turns its instruments on the brain during these states? This is where neuroscience comes in, right?
Precisely. And we're seeing landmark research now actually able to study these experiences in a lab setting. A pivotal study mentioned in your sources comes from Dr. Roland Griffiths and his team at Johns Hopkins University, published back in 2006.
Right, I remember that one. And the headline finding, what was it?
Well, participants given psilocybin reported having mystical experiences. Okay, maybe not surprising. But the truly impactful finding was that these individuals rated the experience as among the most meaningful in their entire lives.
Most meaningful. How meaningful?
They compared it, sometimes directly, to things like the birth of their first child or the death of a parent. Just think about the weight of that comparison for a second.
That's extraordinary. And what was actually happening in their brains while this was going on? Did they see anything?
Uh-huh. Brain imaging shows a really consistent pattern. A significant decrease in activity in the brain's default mode network, or DMN.
Okay, the DMN, remind me, that's like the brain's autopilot, or the seat of the ego, kind of.
That's a good way to put it. It's the network we associate with self-referential thought, mind-wandering, our sense of identity, our story about ourselves, our place in the world.
Right.
So when that network quiets down, as it does so dramatically on psychedelics,
You get these experiences of,
ego dissolution, that feeling of the self just dissolving, becoming one with everything else. These are states, they're deeply described in mystical and spiritual texts across so many traditions.
okay, and this is where it starts to get really interesting. Because building on these brain findings, researchers like Dr. Robin Carhart Harris,
At Imperial College London, yeah.
they've proposed theories about what this might actually mean for consciousness itself.
Exactly. His entropic brain theory suggests that psychedelics temporarily increase the complexity and randomness, the entropy of brain activity.
So less order, more possibility.
Kind of. It moves the brain out of its usual rigid patterns and into a more flexible, interconnected state. And this, he argues, leads to an expanded consciousness.
Expanded consciousness.
And here's the provocative question the sources raise. If this state is one of expanded consciousness, could it potentially be accessing something beyond our ordinary perception? Maybe even, a higher dimension or some kind of universal consciousness.
Hmm. It's where the language of science really starts to bump into concepts that sound very, well, spiritual.
It really is.
And this idea of expanded consciousness makes you wonder about the nature of reality itself, which I guess leads us to another fascinating field your sources explored, this intersection with quantum physics.
Yeah, this adds a completely different and maybe more mind-bending layer. Your sources mention ideas from Nobel laureate Eugene Wigner, who actually contemplated whether consciousness itself might play a fundamental role in shaping reality at the quantum level.
Like the famous double-slit experiment, where just observing changes the outcome.
Exactly that kind of thing. Now, the interpretation is debated, of course, but the experiment itself opens up this huge metaphysical question. Is consciousness just like a local phenomenon stuck inside our heads?
Or is it somehow bigger, interwoven with the universe?
Right. And if it's the latter, could altered states, like the ones induced by psychedelics, maybe allow the mind to perceive aspects of a reality or even a consciousness field that we normally just can't access?
And the sources even go into some pretty cutting-edge theories here, controversial ones maybe?
Definitely controversial. They bring up the orchestrated objective reduction theory, or ORCHR,
Origin?
proposed by figures like Dr. Stuart Hameroff and Sir Roger Penrose. And the basic idea is that consciousness might arise from quantum computations happening within these tiny protein structures in the brain called microtubules.
Okay, hang on. Quantum effects inside the brain's microtubules.
Yeah.
That sounds like science fiction.
It does. It really does. And it's highly, highly debated in the scientific community. But what's significant about theories like ORCHR, at least for our discussion today, is that they suggest consciousness isn't just a simple byproduct of, classical brain activity.
It's something more fundamental.
They open the door to consciousness being something fundamental, potentially irreducible, maybe even hinting at a connection to a universal underlying consciousness, which again resonates with these ancient ideas of the divine. We're truly looking at the edge of current scientific understanding here.
Let's maybe zoom in on one substance that comes up again and again when people talk about these intense encounters. DMT. It's been got that nickname, the God molecule.
DMT is fascinating. It's found in thousands of plants, but also, surprisingly, seems to be produced in trace amounts right inside the human brain. And your sources heavily reference the pioneering research by Rick Strassman, which he detailed in his book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, back in 2001.
Right. And what were his research volunteers consistently reporting? What did they experience?
Time and time again, participants described being, catapulted into these incredibly vivid, hyper-real, alternate dimensions.
Hyper-real.
That's the term they often used. And the most common element was encountering what they perceived as intelligent beings or entities, sometimes even described as a godlike presence.
And these weren't just passive visions.
No, often not. Interactions frequently involve things like telepathic communication, really detailed, complex interactions.
Okay, so the skeptical perspective, the immediate reaction is, okay, powerful drug, powerful brain, powerful hallucinations.
Right. That's certainly one perspective presented in the sources, the standard materialist explanation. But what complicates that simple dismissal is the absolute insistence from so many users that these experiences feel more real, more objective, more profoundly meaningful than ordinary waking reality.
More real than real.
It's the paradox. And your sources draw a parallel here that's quite compelling. Near-death experiences, NDEs.
Ah, right, like the famous case of the neurosurgeon, Dr. Eben Alexander.
Exactly. After his own profound NDE, during which his cortex, the thinking part of his brain, was essentially offline, medically non-functional, he described traveling to this otherworldly realm, just overflowing with infinite love and intelligence.
And his description.
It uncannily mirrors many, many psychedelic reports, particularly DMT reports. And his conclusion, which he detailed in his book, Proof of Heaven, is that consciousness can and does exist separate from the physical brain.
Wow. So comparing NDEs in these psychedelic states, it highlights this sort of shared territory of altered consciousness that really does challenge our basic materialist assumptions about mind and brain.
It really does.
So when science and, intense personal experience bump into something this profound, this hard to categorize, we kind of need philosophy to help us make sense of it, don't we?
We absolutely do. And your sources bring in some key philosophical voices who wrestled with these kinds of states long before we had fMRI machines. William James, for instance, in his classic 1902 work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, he examined mystical consciousness extensively.
And what was his take on these states? Were they just aberrations?
Not at all. He argued that mystical states actually access truths that are, in his words, unplumbed by the discursive intellect.
Meaning?
Meaning truths you can't arrive at just through logical analysis or step-by-step reasoning alone. He looked for the authenticity of these experiences not necessarily in where they came from, but in their fruits, the lasting positive changes they often produced in people.
Like what kind of changes?
A profound sense of unity, interconnectedness, overwhelming love, often a renewed sense of purpose or moral clarity, lasting changes.
Right. And then there's Aldous Huxley. His writing is almost synonymous with the modern exploration of psychedelics.
Absolutely. In The Doors of Perception, Huxley introduced his really famous concept of the brain as a reducing valve.
The reducing valve.
Yeah, he proposed that the brain isn't necessarily producing consciousness, but maybe it's acting more like a filter. It filters out this overwhelming, infinite reality, this mind at large, just so we can function and survive in our limited everyday world.
So psychedelics, in his view, they do what to this valve?
They temporarily open it up. They reduce the filtering efficiency, allowing us to perceive, even if just for a short time, this much larger reality, what he called the mind at large.
As mind at large.
Huxley suggested it could well be synonymous with what many cultures and traditions call God, or the divine ground of being. So these philosophical perspectives, they offer us frameworks, different ways to think about and interpret these incredibly powerful, often just ineffable experiences.
They give us language, maybe?
Exactly. Language and context for what might be happening when the brain enters these extraordinary states.
Okay, so after this whole journey, starting with ancient rituals, moving through the brain scans, the quantum ideas, the DMT encounters, and now philosophy, where does this exploration actually leave us? We're trying to bridge science and something that feels, well, ineffable.
Yeah.
Beyond easy description.
It definitely pushes us right up against the limits of our current scientific understanding, particularly what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, the fundamental mystery of why we have subjective experience at all. Why does it feel like anything to be alive?
Right.
And psychedelic states challenge purely materialist views precisely because they reveal these states that feel so undeniably profound and, yes, are so often described using words like ineffably divine.
Which brings us squarely back to that core question your sources posed right at the start. Is any of this proof of God?
And the sources are pretty clear, I think, that whether you see it as proof depends entirely on your pre-existing worldview, your beliefs. Science can give us brain scans, it can give us chemical analyses.
But it can't hand us a mathematical proof of the divine.
Exactly. It operates on a different level. However, the material offers this really powerful reframing of the question. Instead of asking for proof, maybe consider this. If so many unrelated individuals across diverse cultures, across different historical periods, report remarkably similar, profound experiences of transcendence.
Encountering what feels like a divine presence or ultimate reality?
Right. If that keeps happening, maybe the most interesting question isn't whether God exists in some objective way we can measure, but why we keep meeting him, or it, or encountering this vast consciousness, specifically when the ego's filter that DMN activity is temporarily removed.
Why does that specific subjective experience arise so consistently?
Yeah. It really captures the heart of this tension between the subjective experience and what science can currently objectify.
That is a thought that really stays with you. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, we've followed this thread from ancient rituals, we've explored the neuroscience of ego dissolution, we've pondered these strange, maybe tentative connections to quantum physics, looked at the specific, powerful encounters reported with DMT, and brought in the philosophical voices trying to help us make sense of it all.
And what really emerges from your sources, I think, is that while psychedelics might not provide a neat mathematical equation for God, they consistently occasion these truly transformative experiences. Experiences that align remarkably well with centuries of spiritual accounts and are now genuinely compelling scientists to ask deeper, more fundamental questions about consciousness and the nature of reality itself.
So taking these experiences seriously, as your sources really urge us to do, it opens up a whole new line of inquiry, potentially. One that seeks to maybe bridge that gap between our scientific understanding and spiritual exploration.
It seems like it has to, eventually. And maybe the final thought from your sources, something for you, the listener, to perhaps mull over. If a divine reality or a universal consciousness does exist, maybe psychedelics don't create it in the brain. Perhaps they simply help us perceive something that's already there all the time, but normally hidden from our everyday awareness, by the very limitations of our ordinary minds, by that reducing valve.
A lot to think about indeed. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us into your sources today.
Thanks for guiding us through it.
We really hope this encourages you to continue exploring these profound and, let's face it, sometimes tricky questions yourself.